Hello, this is Dave from the Wizard's Keep in Muncie, Indiana. And last week I posted a video highlighting my tops, or beginning of my top 60 games of all time, counting down from 60 to 51. Well, today we're going to continue that series by counting down my top 50 to 41. And without much further ado, we'll start off with my number 50, and that is Codenames Duet. Now, I picked Codenames Duet primarily because I play a lot of two-player games, and it's a cooperative game, which I like cooperative games quite a bit. So the other regular code names or the different variants of Codename Pictures are excellent games, but Codenames Duet is my favorite among the series. And the reason being is, like I said, is cooperative. I like how if you're not familiar with Codenames, what you're trying to do is the theme of it is your spies, and you're trying to communicate to your teammate code names of the people that's on your side. And how that works is, I'm gonna see here. There's gonna be you're gonna lay out different cards here, and they've got different words on the cards. And what you're trying to do is in Codenames Duet, you've got like 15 total turns that I think you got. Actually, I'm taking that back. I think you got like 7 or 8 total turns, and to find 15 different spies that are on your team. And so you can't just give clues to words specifically naming, like, so they'll only guess one card. So I like how you have to pick different words and try to find clues that combine those words together without getting your opponent to pick other words that are either just bystanders or at worst an assassin. Because if your opponent takes your clue and picks one of the words that's an assassin, then you both lose automatically. So it's kind of an interesting game where you're kind of have to think a little about word connections. I like it quite a bit, and that is Codenames Duet. Now my number 49. When I first heard it described or started looking into it, it sounded horrible because essentially what it is, or in a lot of ways, is a game where you roll dice and you see what happens, which sounds extremely random and not really worth, playing. But my number 49, Machi Koro, surprised me quite a bit when I played it. Because even though it is, in some ways, on your turn, you roll dice and you see what happens. But there's a little more to that. Because when you're rolling dice, you're going to get different numbers, and those numbers are going to correspond to different cards that you've played out on the table. And those cards are going to generate different resources for you, so you can take those resources and buy more cards, and so on. And so it's an engine building game. So you're just rolling dice and see what happens, but you're mitigating those dice rolls quite a bit. Or you're trying to draft certain cards to kind of fill in holes, ideally, so every turn you're getting something for dice rolls. And sometimes you can find cards that allow you to get different resources, or generate different resources when your opponents roll dice. So I like that a lot. I like games where a lot of like engine building games where you kind of start off small, and over the course of the game it builds up more and more. So each turn, the first couple turns, maybe you're not doing much of anything, but those last turns, you're generating lots of stuff, doing a lot of dynamic things, and that kind of is why I like Machi Koro. My number 48 has appeared on at least one list, and maybe multiple, and be either my top 10 gateway games and things like that I did previously, and that is Forbidden Island. Now, Forbidden Island is a cooperative game and an excellent gateway game, as I mentioned before. So, since I've had another video, I'm not going to dwell on it too thoroughly, but basically the theme of it is that you're treasure hunters and the island's sinking, and each player has a different type of treasure hunter, so you have different skills. And so what you're going to be doing is working together to try to gather all the treasures before the island sinks. Now, my next one, my number 47, was my first entry from the game designer Uwe Rosenberg. Now, if you got a chance to see my write-ups last couple years on Facebook, where I wrote out my top 40 and my top 50 games of all time, you'll notice there was a trend, and one of those trends was that I'm a big fan of the designer Uwe Rosenberg. And so, spoilers, there will be future titles by Uwe on this list coming up in the next few weeks. But this is the first one on the list, and that is the two-player game Agricola: All Creatures Great and Small, or Big and Small. And what Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small is, it's a kind of a condensed version of the larger game, Agricola. But this one just focuses on the animal breeding aspect of it, and therefore a much lighter game, and probably in some ways plays better at two players than Agricola does. Which like I said, I play a lot of two-player games, so I like that about it. And what you're doing, if you're not familiar with Agricola, it's a worker placement game. So you're going to have so many workers. In this case, you just have 3. And you're going to place them on different spots on the board to generate actions. And those actions might give you resources, in this case, that you're going to get like different wood and stone that allow you to build pens, or so you can house animals, or you're going to be able to draft different animals that you're going to put in these locations. And if at the end of each turn, if you've got 2 or more of a sheep or a cow, they're going to breed. So you kind of a little bit of an engine building game as well, like Machikoro, where you're kind of setting things out on the board and let them generate the points for you. And I like it quite a bit, and that is Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small. Now, last video, I had a couple deck building games, Dominion and Marvel Legendary, and I talked about how Dominion kind of started this trend with multiple different deck building games, and how many other deck building games have come, but they've kind of improved on the origins that was Dominion. And number 46 is another one of those games, and that is Clank. Now, Clank is a little bit of a different deck building game because it actually has a board as well. It's like a dungeon, a little bit of a dungeon crawl. And you're going to use your cards each turn that you're building a deck that's going to allow you to move throughout the dungeon or fight different monsters, or sometimes, like the title suggests here, may cause clank, which is kind of like you're bouncing around your armor making noises. Because inevitably what you're kind of doing is, as you can see on the art here on the board, there's a sleeping dragon that you're trying to raid into his dungeon, steal as much treasure as you can, and get out before the dragon wakes up. But there's kind of this kind of pressure luck or this risk-reward aspect to the game as well, which I like, which is in the deeper in the dungeon, there's more valuable artifacts. So you can go deeper, but if you go deeper into the dungeon, get those more valuable artifacts, that means you've got to climb all the way out of the dungeon, and which risks meaning the dragon waking up before you can get out. So I kind of like that, where you kind of make, because on the other hand, you can be less risky, just kind of dip your toes in, get something, and get out really fast. You don't necessarily generate many points, but if you can get out of the dungeon and all your opponents go too deep and wake the dragon, you can win the game with minimal points. So there's kind of this interesting dynamic of that risk reward, pressure luck, but also a little bit trying to read your opponents, because if you think that they're going to get in and get out real fast, then maybe you don't want to go too deep. Or if everybody's going too deep, maybe you decide, I want to get out of here real fast and kind of catch them with the dragon. So I like that quite a bit. It's a very different twist to the deck building genre. Next one on my list, my number 45, another entry from Uwe Rosenberg, and that is At the Gates of Luoyang. Now this one kind of doesn't get really talked about that much anymore, and I think the reason is Uwe Rosenberg kind of bust on this scene with Agricola almost 10 years ago now, and then he followed that up the following year with another smash hit, Le Havre. Now both those games were very kind of cutting edge, innovative, and huge smashes. So when I think At the Gates of Luoyang came out, people were kind of expecting the finale or the next one in the trilogy. But it didn't quite live up quite to that hype, so I think in some ways it's kind of gotten forgotten because of that, which is kind of a shame, because At the Gates of Luoyang is also an excellent game. The theme of it is your merchants outside, the Gates of Luoyang, and on your turn you're going to be drafting different cards, and some of those cards are like getting different customers or contracts for customers, or you might be generating different resources so you can fulfill those contracts. Typical Uwe Rosenberg, resource management type of game. Another great one, and that was my number 45. Now my number 44, a little bit different than some of these previous ones, and that is Letters from Whitechapel. Usually a lot of games, especially the Euro games, it's not necessarily, it's more about the mechanisms or the mechanics or the strategy of the game, and not necessarily the theme. But one of the ones I really like about this is the theme. I'm a big fan of that kind of gothic Ripper lore, but there's also, it's not just the theme, it's also a great game as well. And Letters from Whitechapel, one player plays Jack the Ripper, and everyone else plays members of the kind of like the Scotland Yard of the police force hunting down Jack the Ripper. But it's a hidden movement game, which what that means is the player playing Jack the Ripper doesn't have a piece on the board. They're going to instead be writing down on a pad of paper their locations or where they're moving, and the other players of Scotland Yard have to kind of be kind of looking at the map, and you can tell because each round starts off with a victim being killed. One of the Ripper victims dies, and so Jack the Ripper, you know where Jack the Ripper's starting at that location, but you don't know which route he moves. But you can try to guess by where he's moved previously, because he's always trying to get back to his home base before the night ends. And so you use those clues, and you have 4 nights to try to track down Jack the Ripper before he gets away forever. And so I like the theme, I like the little twist, and there's also a lot of suspense in this game, because so even though Jack the Ripper is a hidden movement, there's great because what you're doing with Jack the Ripper, you're writing down different numbers. Each location on the map has a number. So the members of Scotland Yard might be kind of talking amongst themselves. So they say, I think he's at number 43, or I think he's at number 75. And the Jack the Ripper player, maybe Jack the Ripper is at 75. So you got to keep this kind of poker face. Don't give any signs that, oh man, they're onto me. They're about to look where I'm at. And if they do that, they're going to catch me and win. So, and then at the last second, they go, oh no, let's check 43 instead. And you're like, oh, like breathe a sigh of relief. But you can't you have to do that internally because you don't want to reveal how close they got. So it generates a lot of suspense, which is also, for a relatively simple game, is a lot of the fun of that game. My number 43 is also a deduction game, but with a little bit different mechanics and a little bit different twist. And that's the great thing about board games. Is a lot of times you can have some of the same ideas, but you can do it many, many different ways. And this one does that, and that is Mysterium. Now, Mysterium is just a stunning art, but it's a deduction game, a cooperative deduction game, where one person is a ghost and everyone else is psychic investigators. And whereas in Letters from Whitechapel, the kind of similar dynamic, it's one person and then everybody else is like investigators. Well, where Letters from Whitechapel, that person's trying to throw the investigators off their scent. In this one, the ghost is trying to help the investigators, but the ghost can't speak. The ghost instead gives different textless pictures. Like this is kind of an example, would be like a card here, just has a stunning art on it, but there's no text or anything on it. And that's supposed to be like a psychic impression that the psychic investigators are supposed to look at this picture and maybe figure out clues. What is the ghost trying to tell me? Because inevitably what the ghost is trying to eventually tell the psychic investigators is how the ghost was murdered. And the same things you're looking for in Clue, like the murderer, the weapon that was used in what location or room, but it takes a very different route than Clue to get there, and which I like that, just kind of different. And where in Letters from Whitechapel you've got these where the ghost is not speaking, but it's a different type of suspense. You're trying to figure out, are they going to guess? Do they see what I see in that art? Or are they going to guess the clue that in the background of that picture, there's something that looks like a saw blade, so they're going to guess that it was the bladed weapon that was the murderer. Or there's hanging meat, or these balloons in the background. It looks like the hanging meat in the cellar in this room. So it's just a nice twist, very different than a lot of other games. Now my number 42... and my number 41, kind of jump ahead a little bit, both are very, very classic games. I'm a big fan of a lot of the new games coming out. Board games just keep getting better and better. Every year seems like there's a bunch of new games that are better than the crop that came the year before. But there's still a place, at least in my heart, for the classic games as well. And number 42 is one of those. And that is Settlers of Catan. Now this is like the granddaddy, and this is the one that started the board game revolution. And for good reason, because it was very different. It showed people that you could play games that weren't super complex in rules, but can be fairly complex in strategy, which allowed a greater access to people playing. Plus, this game, everybody's always involved, because what you do in Settlers of Catan, you're going to roll 2 6-sided dice, and that's going to, when the number comes up, it's going to generate different resources for players that have settlements on locations that match that number. So that means even though it's my turn and I roll the dice and I roll a 6 and you have a settlement on the number 6, you're going to generate that resource. So in that case, even though it's my turn, you're engaged. It's not like I'm going to sit around here and twiddle my thumbs until it's my turn again. The second thing that makes sure everybody's involved every turn is this diplomacy and trading element. Because the way the game is set up, there's 5 different resources, but you're never going to be able to have access to all 5 resources. Though you need all 5 resources at different times to build different, either build roads, build new settlements, buy development cards, things like that. But since you never have access to them, you have to trade with other players that do. So, since they won't have access to everything as well, they're going to need to trade. So you kind of work out a lot of different bartering and diplomacy elements of trading different goods. And I think it's a very different thing than some other games, especially some other games or many games I had played before I played Settlers. And so as a result, that always has a warm place in my heart. And number 41, the last one on the list today, is, you can't really talk about Settlers without talking about Carcassonne. And Carcassone's another classic gateway game, and it's been around, well, it seems like it's only about 18 years old. I mean, Monopoly came out in 1935. But in board game terms, especially since, we're every couple months there's a new crop of game, like games coming out, and it feels like if a game's like 6 months old, it's an old game. But, Carcassone's still a classic. It's a tile-laying game, where what you're going to do every turn is you're going to lay a tile down, very like Catan, very, very simple mechanics, but which means that anybody can play. I've played Carcassonne with my parents, or at least my mom, before, and she's not a gamer by any means, but she was able to play this one and not get too lost. And so what you're going to do in Carcassonne, which is nice, because what you're doing in Carcassonne, you're laying different tiles down, and then on your turn, you decide if you want to lay one of your meeples on that tile you just placed. So it's got enough strategy, and that's like Catan and Carcassonne where they really shine, is they got enough strategy in them that they can keep a gamer engaged, but they're not so overwhelming that a non-gamer can't play them. And that's really the greatness of these games, because you're going to lay a tile down, decide you want to lay a meeple on that tile, and there's different locations on the tile. There could be put them on the road, you could put them in a city, you could put them in your meeples in a field and make a farmer. The farmers generate tons of points, but when you lay the farmer out there, that meeple's stuck out on the board for the rest of the game. Whereas if you lay a meeple on a road, you may not generate as many points as the farmer, but once that road's completed, you're going to get that meeple right back, and you can reuse that because you have a finite number of meeples. So it's some different considerations that you're trying to go for. So that's my number 50 through number 41. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about any of these games, please post here on Facebook, or feel free to stop into the Wizard's Keep anytime and ask me about any of these games or any other games. Until next week when I get my next video up, thank you for watching.